Welcome, everyone. We could have your attention. We're pleased to again offer this year our Great Lenten Lecture series. And we're going to start out with reader Michael Marsh. Michael has the title of his talk as Technology, Tool, and Temptation. So that should be pretty interesting, especially for those of us who are just using that brain-sucking device, which is called a cell phone, a little bit too much during Great Lent. This could be something really wonderful. So we'll ask your attention and to hold the side conversations to a very bare minimum. And after Michael makes his presentation, then we'll have the opportunity for questions and answers. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michael. Thank you, Michael, for taking the time to prepare this for us today.
Thank you, Father. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Brothers and sisters, I hope everyone has had a blessed and profitable clean week and have been taking advantage of all the opportunities that we've had to attend the services physically in person, which we'll hear is very important later. I've been blessed with this opportunity to give this talk on something of great spiritual importance during this time of perhaps the greatest spiritual importance. As I see it, and as we'll see later, the Holy Fathers see it, our fast is threatened by what Elder Emilianos of blessed memory refers to as a most dreadful enemy, and says that we're becoming, also in his words, slaves to images and information which fill our lives. Now, Elder Emilianos, for those who aren't aware, was a holy Athonite elder whose preaching in the world inspired a monastic revival in Greece and Mount Athos. He reposed just about 4 years ago today, so he's very, he knows a lot, he would know a lot about this topic, and gave a very good homily on technology that I'm going to be drawing a lot from today. So this will not, strictly speaking, be an anti-technology talk, as the teaching of the Holy Fathers in the Church is clearly not anti-technology. But if we want to be faithful to the entirety of their teachings, we also have to take a critical eye to the very real dangers of modern information technology, phones, these things, computers, television, and the internet generally speaking. So in order to understand where we are today, we need to take a brief look at history, and we'll start, like any good history, from the book of Genesis. As we read in the first chapters of Genesis, and as many Holy Fathers emphasize, there was no technology before the fall of man. Not being subject to bodily corruption, we had no need for earthly technology such as agriculture, hunting tools, or shelter to nourish our bodies and to mitigate the effects of the fallen world. Is that okay? We didn't even have a need for spiritual technology, like a temple, altar, vestments, or icons, due to already having a direct connection with God and all of creation being, in a sense, a temple of worship already. After the fall, when our spiritual separation when we were separated from God spiritually and physically expelled from paradise, as we heard about last Sunday, God gave us or allowed us to invent technology, which is, in the words of St. Basil the Great, necessary in itself to life and provides many facilities. We also see in Genesis that spiritual technology used for worship, comes from the line of Seth, Adam's righteous son born to replace Abel, and earthly technology, which we use to sustain our lives, comes from the line of Cain. Cain himself founded the first city named after his first son Enoch, who, according to Elder Emilianos, became a brick mason and builder of cities himself. Jubal and Tubal-Cain, his other descendants, invented instruments and metalsmithing, respectively. Now, Genesis tells us that Seth's first son, Enosh, first hoped in the Lord and called upon his name. And Elder Emilianos explains that part of this was setting up the first public worship congregation, a spiritual technology. And today, of all days, we're celebrating a very particular kind of spiritual technology, icons, which, as the Seventh Ecumenical Council states, are open books to remind us of God. So we have the descendants of Seth and Cain with these kind of dual and contrasting origins of spiritual and earthly technology, which is interesting, perhaps important to reflect on. It may explain why we're so quick to make idols of the earthly technology that sustains our bodies, but we could accidentally damage our souls with it. But we don't want to go too far with the implications of that, because we have explicit teachings from the Holy Fathers about the God-givenness of both spiritual and earthly technology. In fact, Elder Emilianos, again, speaking with the mind of the Church, says, "The Church and monasticism are not hostilely disposed towards technological progress." He gives the example of St. Athanasius of Mount Athos inventing a mechanical bread kneading device, which was the best of its manufacture of its time, a device driven by animals to knead the bread and lessen the needs for monks to miss services. And this also illustrates how wise usage of technology in general can aid in spiritual life rather than hinder. Both St. Basil the Great and St. Gregory of Nyssa make it clear that technology in general is a gift from God to alleviate the burden of the fallen world and allow us to maintain some semblance of our pre-fall mastery over nature. For example, if nature is fallen and slightly hostile to us now, we can at least build shelters and other things to protect our bodies, even though we're not in the state of Adam, we're not in the pre-fall state. Now, since technology is a gift that will always be with us in some form before the end of the world, Elder Emilianos says we can look to the monastery and monastic rules for our criteria on how to apply technology to our lives, and that the two most important principles are restraint and maintenance of spiritual vigilance. St. Basil says technology should only be chosen that contributes to the peace and tranquility of monastic life, and that the unity of the life of the brotherhood is preserved, undistracted, and devoted to the Lord. St. Peter of Damascus adds, "Everything that does not serve a pressing need becomes an obstacle to those who would be saved. Everything that does not contribute to the salvation of the soul or to the life of the body." Now that we have kind of a general overview of the Church's teaching on technology and its proper use, we can now turn to the Church's teachings on spiritual vigilance and inner life, which will illumine some of the problems we have with modern technology. And we have a really great, very quotable quote from Elder Emilianos, again, in his own talk, where he says, "The most dreadful enemy created by post-industrial culture, the culture of information technology and the image, is cunning distraction. The majority of the faithful of the Church confess that they do not manage to pray, to concentrate and cast off those cares of the world and storms of the spirit and soul, which are to the detriment of sobriety, inner balance, enjoyable work, family tranquility, and a constructive social life. The world of the industrial image degenerates into real idolatry." So why does he have such strong words? In order to understand this, we must understand how important watchfulness and a focused mind and heart is to our salvation. This week in the Great Canon, we've heard 4 times actually in 2 different languages, the Kontakion, a part of which says, addressing our own souls, "Wake then and be watchful, that Christ our God may spare you." We clearly hear that watchfulness and attentiveness are preconditions to salvation. This is echoed in the Lord's parables, such as the watchful servants and the wise and foolish virgins, as we will soon enough hymn in bridegroom matins during Holy Week. Now, a full treatment of watchfulness is a whole other talk or series of talks, but it suffices to say that it's emphasized throughout countless of our spiritual texts with constant, strong admonitions to the maintenance of spiritual vigilance. And Elder Emilianos says the teachings of the Fathers concerning spiritual vigilance arms people so that they can stave off the disastrous effects of technological society. So what are these disastrous effects he speaks of? Let's focus on the most important problem, how, as he stated earlier, the majority of the faithful of the Church confess that they do not manage to pray. So here's a scenario. try going on the internet. This could mean something as obviously questionable as social media, or something as seemingly innocent as looking up a Lenten recipe. With the social media or an entertainment site, you can just keep scrolling and have a constant flow of new information about a wide variety of things, scattering your thoughts every which way and really kind of overloading you. And this is without even referencing the flood of negative emotions such as envy, self-righteousness, or anger that can inevitably arise when using social media. Even with the example where you're going to look up a recipe, if you're not careful, you can end up clicking on continual links to ingredients. Maybe you look up nutritional information on each. Maybe that takes you to a blog where you see an interesting article about exercise or something completely unrelated to your original goal of learning the new recipe. So with this sort of scattered state of mind, try doing this for about an hour or so, maybe at night before your prayer rule. Now try to pray and truly focus on and mean the words that you're speaking. Is it any wonder that it's difficult? In both of the examples, you're ostensibly focused on one physical thing, the blinking screen, but internally your mind and heart are darting every which way, which is the very opposite of spiritual vigilance or watchfulness. The secular author Nicholas Carr, who wrote a book called The Shallows, which is cited a lot by contemporary Orthodox commentators on the internet, says that the internet seizes our attention in order to scatter it. I think that puts it perfectly. Now, in many ways, this kind of becoming scatterbrain, these are personal failings on our part, but it's also important to dispel the myth of neutrality, because the common line is it's not the technology, it's how you use it, right? Which is technically true, but there are a few particular properties of this kind of technology, again, computers, phones, television, that can tip the scales in a negative direction. The first and most important is their disembodied, purely intellectual nature, as well as the fact that it's not really a question of just your own personal use, which we'll get to in a minute. So the first point, that usage of information technology, given the name information, it's information, it's purely intellectual, kind of separate from the body. Rather than having a tangible effect on the world in front of us, like you would with a hammer, information technology scatters our attention in a way that's not bound by the limitations of physical space. You can be learning about, or getting information about, learning is kind of a strong term. You can be getting information about any number of things coming from news anywhere. Now, this is a problem because God was incarnate as a flesh and blood man, not an image or video in an array of pixels on a screen like this. We need the physical church and sacraments for our salvation. We strive to know God in reality, both spiritual and physical, in a truly personal relationship that requires effort, much like any real human relationship. The saints who encountered God felt him unmistakably in both soul and body, describing sweetness and fragrance, other physical sensations. Nikolai Motovilov described a warm feeling when St. Seraphim of Sarov called the Holy Spirit down to them. Consider the true definition of a theologian as one who has had direct experience of God to an even greater degree than the other saints already have. Any appearance of philosophizing or scholarship from a saintly theologian is merely their putting into words what they have experienced directly firsthand for the benefit of readers who are far less experienced, such as ourselves. Even though many saints happen to be well educated, it's important not to confuse these things, since we are lacking in experience, not intellectualism. St. Mark the ascetic states, even though knowledge is true, referring to intellectual knowledge, it is still not firmly established if unaccompanied by works, for everything is established by being put into practice. And we heard in the Great Canon back on Monday, with reference to Jacob laboring to win 2 wives, without labors, my soul, neither action nor contemplation will achieve success. This idea of establishing knowledge by action applies to all areas of life. Personal relationships, learning a new skill, learning to navigate a new area, really anything. Is it any wonder that it applies even more so to our spiritual life? Elder Emilianos stated before that technological distractions aren't just bad for prayer and inner stillness, but for enjoyable work, family tranquility, and a constructive social life. Now that we've covered maybe the most important reason why these things can tend to hurt us rather than help us, there's another important point to keep in mind, that even if we use these things to the best of our intentions, even if we implement all of the practical tips, which we'll discuss in a minute, the use of computers or phones, anything connected to the internet, is still not really entirely up to us. With just about anything you do on one of these devices, there's some team of programmers, usually working for a very big, very atheistic tech company, who have already applied their will and their intentions to make the device do everything that it does, including carefully engineering most of the applications to be as addicting as possible, so that we spend more and more time in that distracted state that we're talking about. A phone or a computer isn't like a hammer where you just own the material, like this glass, this plastic and metal. It's not very interesting by itself. It's not like you just own the material and use it on your own. It's always used in collaboration with someone else, everyone working in the background, usually several other people, companies working behind the scenes for good and for ill. Usually ill, but so this combined with the disembodied nature of tech that we discussed a minute ago makes for a very potent threat to our spiritual life that demands a response. In closing, a response is what we'll give now, which is some practical advice on how to reduce all of these negative effects. So as a spiritual disclaimer, I'm not a priest, and this is not pastoral advice. So Fathers Gregory and Colin, please feel free to interject. None of these are outwardly spiritual, but they should all be done with prayer, as everything should be, so that we can ask God to help us. So the first thing is to simply go outside and move around, especially if you have a job that involves heavy computer usage or are a student. If you already have a job that's more hands-on, this is less relevant, although the outdoors is nice. The most important thing, indoors or out, is to get some physical activity to bring you back to reality, whether it's strenuous exercise, a leisurely walk, or even some household task like washing the dishes. Just do something to bring your mind back in sync with the body so that we can stay full human persons, body and soul. Even I work as a software programmer, a job that's necessarily requires being on a computer, and I find that I can just think more clearly about even job-related tasks when I'm out and moving around away from the computer. The next point is kind of related to when we're using or have to use these things, to make a habit of never using the computer or phone without a clear goal or purpose in mind. So for example, if you're looking up a recipe, find it, print it, and then turn the phone off or turn the computer off, put it down. If you're working on a computer, like during the day again, this principle extends to your usage of software on the computer, such as not checking email or chat messages right in the middle of some other work-related task. Make each piece of software you use on the computer intentional. If you sit down and pick up your phone, just ask yourself why. Do you intend to call or text a specific person, or maybe look up a specific piece of information? If so, do that, and then put the phone away. Otherwise, it's probably best to just put the phone away and pick up a book or do something physical, if it's just pure leisure. The key here is intentionality, to make sure that we always use our tools to serve a pressing need, as St. Peter of Damascus said earlier, and maintain spiritual vigilance rather than allowing ourselves to stumble into the many snares inherent to these things. The third point is just something small that I personally found helpful. to acquire and use a physical alarm clock in place of your phones. This eliminates the need to interact with the phone the first thing in the morning, allowing you to even charge it in a separate room while you sleep. You can have your prayer book be the first and last thing that you touch the end of day in the morning. The last and final point is very simple and straightforward, but potentially difficult. Just delete all social media accounts, not just the apps on your phone, but the accounts themselves. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and all the other. We all know what these things are. Everyone you want to stay in touch with, you probably already have their phone numbers anyway. And if you've never met the people on those platforms in person, you probably won't miss them very much, assuming you interact regularly with real people. I'm told we're going to be hearing something about this next week, talk about friendship.
Yes.
If this is too difficult, just completely deleting things, at least consider abstaining from these things during fasting days and fasting periods. Unlike the food fast, which weakens the body in order to ultimately strengthen the soul, abstaining from social media will strengthen the mind, soul, and body. So it's a win-win-win. With all that said, I hope this talk has been edifying and not too self-indulgent on my part. It may seem very negative, but God has put us here for our salvation and has given us the tools we need with His help to overcome. As Elder Emilianos concludes in his own talk, restraint and spiritual vigilance are, for all those who come into the world, a weapon made ready from the experience of the monastic life and Orthodox tradition in general, one which abolishes the servitude of humanity and preserves our health and sovereignty as children of God. Thank you.
All right, we have some opportunity for questions now. That was really great, Michael. Thank you so much. I couldn't stop thinking about something that I heard a few weeks ago. I was listening to a podcast, which probably isn't good, but I'll ask Michael later if that's okay. And the person there made the argument that when you go to the grocery store, you have an exit strategy, right? You know how you're getting out of there. But when you pick up your phone, there's nothing. There's no end point if you don't create an end point. They don't come with a self-destruct mechanism, so that won't work. But there has to be a way to end your session. And so that's something I think if we can even just pick up that habit in Great Lent, that's a wonderful habit. You have to have an exit strategy. You know how you're going to get out of the grocery store. You don't know what you're going to do once you pick up the phone. You have to have a way to exit that session. And I'm a big fan of putting alarms on the phone. So you pick up your phone, you set a 30-minute alarm, and when it goes off, then you're done. So anyway, that's tactical. That's not really strategic. But in any case, I thought that was really funny. We have an exit strategy for the grocery store. We don't have an exit strategy for our phone. All right, questions, Father.
So allow me to just ask a question. Would you say the issue of going for one thing and then ending up with another, is it the system in of itself, as in the ability to find other things related or given to you as an option to look at, that's the issue, or that in most of the times it tends to lead to distractions, like distraction material? Not that the system itself is bad, but that what's being supplied.
Do you mean like when you go start looking for an air conditioner and you end by looking at African masks? Not that I've ever had that personally happen.
You're talking specifically about hyperlinks, correct? You would go onto a website and then there's something like you said with the ingredients. There's a link for the ingredients. You click on that and it takes you to another page.
Yeah, I'm asking if it's the system in of itself, like driving from one thing to the next, that's the issue, or that these systems tend to be used to either commercialize something or to just eat your time for ads.
I'd say it's all of the above. The non-physical medium and how easy it is to just jump from one thing to the next creates it just makes it that much more appealing, that temptation. Like you wouldn't drive around town going to like just random different places on a whim necessarily. But the fact that the internet is set up that way, that makes it really easy to find related information if you're focused, if you have a legitimate use, also creates a lot of temptation to distraction, which is then capitalized on by really the creators and maintainers of this technology for advertising and all of that other stuff.
But you would say that it, like, in of itself, that's a negative. Like, the system itself is negative. Like, go to one thing, other options appear.
Yeah, it's very prone to temptation.
So,
Yeah.
But you wouldn't say it in totality. For example, if you were to look up like the calendar app for the church or something, you're looking up the Tropari of the day, and then you're looking for the saint list, and you see the saint you've never heard of before. You click it, find the slide of the saint. Wouldn't that be a beneficial thing that still kind of wasn't what you were intending to do, but you end up learning something that might be very beneficial?
It could be. And it just depends on the context, but we'll let the priest speak.
All right. So I guess do you mind if I comment?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll comment. So this is actually something that Nicholas Carr talks about a lot in his book, in terms of knowledge, right? And this is something that the fathers talk about a lot. There are three kinds of knowledge. There's theoretical knowledge, which is knowledge that has the potential to become actual. There's true knowledge, and there's spurious knowledge. Spurious knowledge is that which we have taken within ourselves. Spurious knowledge is the rejection of truth over that which we want to be true. But the point is, and Nicholas Carr talks about this a lot in his book, whether he realizes it or not, the Shallows is essentially the philokalia for secular folk. He talks about deep thinking, right, and how reading of books or reading of things that don't have distractions cultivate deep thinking, right? And deep thinking is necessary in order to actually acquire knowledge and take it within ourselves. Now, in order to do that, you have to remove all external distractions, all other stimuli, and be able to focus on, which is why the written word is the best, without doubt, way of obtaining knowledge. But with hyperlinks, the moment you see a hyperlink, no matter what it is, no matter what the content is, you now have to evaluate the validity of using that link.
They
and you're
measure
just
people's brains.
right.
They read things on the internet with hyperlinks.
Right. So the moment you see that, any attempt at gaining true knowledge is gone. It's just gone because you've now evaluated the validity of that link and the usefulness of it. And you can click on it, and the knowledge may very well be useful, but it's not actually going to be acquired by you because you're distracted. You're now searching for other links. And that's the way that the internet works when you're looking at the screen. You're constantly trying to see where this will lead you instead of engaging with the material that's in front of you. So, the best way to read, if you actually want to learn anything, is the complete elimination of any hyperlinks at all, or to take that material and print it and look at a physical rendition of it. So that's really all I can say about that.
So that comment that the Shallows is like the philokalia for secular folk reminds me of a quote from that book that I wanted to kind of shoehorn in here, but couldn't find a way. But I'll do it now because it's really good. In the Shallows, the author cites another author, Marshall McLuhan, a thinker from the 70s and 80s, who talked a lot about television in the same way, who said, who coined the term, the medium is the message. Like some of you might have heard of this, that the medium, so the television or the phone, the fact that you're on the internet is far more important than the actual content that you're looking at. Like it could be an icon, it could be an image of an icon, or it could be social media. And Marshall McLuhan uses a quote that sounds like it could have come straight out of the philokalia. He says the content of the medium is the meat that distracts the watchdog of the mind. And it just a Holy Father could have written that.
So kind of just playing devil's advocate here. What if the end result necessarily isn't the acquiring of deep set knowledge, but the introduction of something that you wouldn't have sought initially? Let's say that you are because this I'm sure has been happening recently in world. Someone who is disheartened with their local parish, they're like, oh, things are changing every year, yada, 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 and they're looking more into their faith, and they suddenly see this thing about Orthodox Christianity, and they're like, oh, what is this thing? And they're not going to acquire the deep, spiritual knowledge that is required to be an Orthodox Christian just by, reading the Wikipedia page. But maybe that will inspire them to seek more into that by being introduced to knowledge that they weren't intending initially to receive.
Yes, yeah, and that's a perfect point. That information is just information. It's just information. It could be useful, it could be not useful, but it has to be, as Saint Mark the Ascetic and many other Holy Fathers said, it has to be acted on in order to become real. There's also a real danger. I'm sure a lot of us, especially younger, who've been on the internet, around the Orthodox internet, have encountered this. There's a danger that someone won't move on from that phase of seeking information and confuse actually gathering information about orthodoxy or whatever else with actually learning about the thing, where in reality they're just off in their own heads being distracted.
I think that's an important point. I'll grab the mic. I'm being told to grab the mic. There's a confusion, I think, of terms where people often look at knowledge and information as synonymous, and they are not. There's information on the internet, but it is impossible. The way it's designed, it's simply not possible for that in that medium for it to actually become knowledge. So it's good that people could perhaps discover orthodoxy from the internet, but they're never going to truly become Orthodox unless they put the internet away, go to a parish, and actually absorb the faith and embody the faith. But it's just, if they just stay on the internet or continue to use this as their fundamental resource, then they're never going to actually become Orthodox in any meaningful sense. They might be really unbearable to deal with on the internet, which is probably what's going to happen more often than not. But it's the goal, especially of say a parish setting and with catechism, is to get people out of that and get them into living an actual real life in the real world in a real parish. If you stay on the internet, then it's never going to be true. It's just going to be you're theoretically Orthodox, but are you really Orthodox?
So I guess my point would be then it's not beneficial for the acquiring of wisdom as much as it's useful to discover information that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to maybe not directly ascertain yourself.
Yeah.
That way there is a benefit.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there is some benefit. So I was careful not to say that the system itself is completely bad, but there's just a lot of temptations bound up in the fundamental structure of the system that we have to be hyper vigilant about.
Other questions for Michael? Go ahead, Marie. Will you repeat your questions?
Two questions, Doctor. One is, you mentioned that in the canon of St. Andrew about watchfulness of the soul, right? But at that time when the canon was written, or the internet or whatever, so even without technology, whatever, internet, it's hard to be watchful, right? So what do you think that even if we got rid of it, what will be watchful even if people in whatever centuries, and then what, 6th century?
He was at the 7th Ecumenical Council, so 8th century.
8th century. So even at that time, it was hard for people to be watchful. I'm not sure, I can be watchful without even the internet. How do you think it actually can do it? And the second question, Father Colin already kind of answered some of it. Even say sometimes I listen something spiritual, right? It can be a priest or something, but compared to reading a book, it's still not the same, I guess, right? It's still kind of like an entertainment compared to reading a book, which is a work. And so, do you think that still reading is much more beneficial than listening, even like some spiritual?
Yes, yeah. I'll repeat the questions. I'll kind of work backward. I'll start with the last question. That reading a book, is reading a book or some physical medium basically consuming would it be consuming the same information in a digital format, or
No, but I mean like not audiobook. I was like, like priest talking or documentary film about like the Holy Mountain or something like that.
Yeah, there is a like the content does matter that you're consuming in this medium. It's just that everybody kind of knows that, and it's easy. It's more. It's easy to forget the effect that the medium itself is having on our minds, and it just has to be done with intentionality.
So do you, actually is it a data that it's proved that when you read you remember better?
There is the studies and the kinds of books we were talking about. They call it, I think is it L-shaped reading or F-shaped reading?
F-shaped reading, yeah.
That when someone reads a book or physical paper, they read as you'd expect. They're reading through the text, but when the same sensors are measuring how they read on a computer screen, they kind of skim down and then read in detail in certain parts, not every paragraph, but they kind of read and take in information in an F shape. So there are like physical differences in the way that it works.
Do you have any knowledge about data, say reading a book and listening to the same book? Is it different? Will you remember more when you read or the same book? Like
Not offhand, but I would guess.
There's actually no difference in as much as you treat the audiobook like you would with a book, where you remove all external circumstances and actually listen. So
repeat the question and the answer.
So the question was the difference between listening to an audiobook versus reading the same physical book. Father Colin pointed out that there's no difference if you actually treat the audiobook like you would the physical book, where you sit down and don't do anything else. You could even close your eyes and listen. Yeah.
Well, actually, there is a difference.
At that point, you might as well just read the book.
well, and that's why we do reading in the church, right? It very much, so long as you're attentive, is the same thing. Honestly, it's probably even better doing it in the church than reading it at home, because it's an environment that is designed for attention if you take advantage of it.
Let's contextualize. Father, you
Well, there is a difference, a fundamental difference. Well, so when you're listening a book and reading a book, then the technologies are different, because reading a book is a technology. A book is a technology. It's written word. And listening to the book, it doesn't make sense, because you don't have to listen to the book. You just listen to the spoken words and orally. And I'm not sure what technology is involved there. It's a matter of technology. One is book. There is a technology, another there is no technology. And even the word watchfulness implies that you are relying on some technology, which is written word. But in the early church, of course, it was like that. So it was transmitted orally. So Gospels were transmitted orally, and then only later they were written. So here we started depending on some technology. So this, your question, like simple question, which is more effective, it's either listening to the book or reading a book. It's a question of technology. Which technology you are depending more on? And I think the answer is obvious, that all our vocabulary, it draws heavily on everything visual. So what you do with that non-visual component on the internet, that's pretty interesting. So it's getting past your familiarity with technology, and there might be interesting things there.
But it's interesting. So if you're listening to some spiritual book, it's like many times Father Gregory told us that first Christians, they were literal, so they were attentive, I guess. That's why they remember.
Yeah, you are attentive to a priest giving a sermon, for example, or some elder may be speaking to you directly, so it's a different thing.
So if you attentively listen to a book, then it's not much difference.
That maybe by listening to original things, you learn to be attentive, and without being watchful, because you are not watching anything. So that's the point.
Have you read The Shallows, Father?
Part of that long ago.
Oh, could get a copy from one of us.
As just a quick anecdote to that, St. Anthony the Great had the entire Gospels, all 4 Gospels, in the Psalter memorized, but he never knew how to read. So it was all from, that's something that St. Athanasio says in the life, is that it was just from him being in church, he was able to memorize those because it was being read and he was paying attention. So
if you're Saint Anthony, you can do it. If you're me, you can't probably.
Well, the average it's an oral culture. The average person back then had more brain capacity for that kind of memorization.
It's actually even more mystical than that, right? What do we learn in the life of Saint Mary of Egypt? Not only did she not go to not read, she was illiterate. She also lived in the desert for 40-something years. She learned the gospel and the scriptures by her close relationship with God. So we get to a sort of certain point of human capacity, and then there's beyond that, where St. Mary was. So that I find very interesting, and probably doesn't really add value to this particular conversation, but it's interesting. That's probably a very internet hyperlink kind of thing to say, but that she learned the scripture, and she told Zosimus, if you remember, that those who live close, I can't quote exactly, but when you live closely with God, then you learn the scripture, you're taught the scripture. So that's very interesting. In a few weeks, we'll listen to her life again in church, and listen carefully to that part. It's very interesting.
And to get back to your first question, I was here talking about the Great Canon and the Fathers of the Philokalia, but we're living in modern times. And we have a lot of distraction, but they're talking about being watchful and attentive, and they didn't have all the distractions that we have. It reminds me of something Father Seraphim Rose said, who he talked a lot about. He lived before the internet, but he would talk a lot about television and the general culture of entertainment and amusement seeking, and how we are really into that in this country. And he said, when we look at the example of the early fathers in this area, it should call us to humility. We know that we're so far from them, but we just have to be humble. We have to ask God to forgive us, ask God to help us, and just do our best to at least get to some level of sanity, knowing that we're never going to reach the heights of the great fathers of old.
Or common people of the 8th century.
Yeah, exactly. Even more humility.
Don't call on her. I wouldn't call on her.
Don't do it.
She looks dangerous.
Yes.
I just want to move the question a step further. So we were talking about consuming spiritual edification material, like talks or podcasts, what have you. But you mentioned in your talk about how Christ was a person, the church is material, well, and immaterial, but so a step further from the podcast, so what do you think about praying to a service that you, a video of a divine liturgy that you find online, or prayers in a cathist, or do you watch the video and pray with the video, or do you just do a prayer on your own in front of your icons without the video? How do you navigate that sphere?
So I'm going to steal the microphone from Michael just because Archbishop Peter gave specific instructions. So it'll be very interesting to hear what Michael has to say, but we might as well hear what Ulrika said. So he's not a real big fan of video, and he feels like just adds on distraction. And so he instructed us to tell people, and we've sent it out and so on and so forth, but a lot of times folks don't notice, they're distracted by other things, that you should turn the lights down, light a lamp or a candle. You should, if you're engaging via video, you should turn the video away from yourself, and you should go to your icon corner, and you should pray just as you would if you were in church and the reader was reading and the choir was singing. It should be exactly the same, to the greatest extent that you can make that happen. And that if you can be in church, that's always better, but we understand that's not always possible. But in that case, it should be that kind of a prayerful thing. You don't pop popcorn, not that you would do this, but I know people who have done this. You don't pop the popcorn, sit down, put the service on the wide screen on Sunday morning, in the pajamas, and watch. We don't watch church. We participate in the service. And so I think that's a really important point, and Politica is really very keen to make sure that we try as best as possible not to be distracted by the video, but that we don't watch, but we pray during the services, whether we're physically present or whether we're participating for whatever reason remotely.
And do you think, I guess this question is probably very, do you think,
Follow-up question.
do you think it's rather irreverent to do
Pop
that?
popcorn and
Well, like, let's say you're like
Not even
just
addiction, just
doing something like cleaning the house and you have it playing, like that's just like unacceptable.
listen, spiritual life is mostly about making decisions between two things, neither of which are good. So it can be bad and worse, or just two things which are not. It's not always good and bad. We have this weird fantasy about spiritual life. That's not the way it is. Sometimes it is, but those are the easy ones. That takes like 2 seconds. So you're cleaning the house. You have two choices. You can turn on pop music and be edified that way, or you can turn on something which is spiritual and be edified that way. I would always go for the more spiritual edification. The other thing that we can't even fathom in this day and age is to do something in silence. That's just crazy talk. I understand that. But that's the way humans were created, to mostly engage with silence. And we are constantly stimulated in every possible way, not just by that evil thing that's in our pocket, but by other things as well. So sometimes, and I think Great Lent is probably a good time to do that, we should challenge ourselves to actually engage in silence. It will first drive you almost crazy. I mean, like literally, it just makes you not even be able to be at peace. But that is a very good way for us to strengthen ourselves spiritually, is to sometimes not be engaged in anything, but actually just to be silent. So, good questions?
Well, how about the Jesus prayer? You can just.
That is allowed, yes.
Yes. I mean, it's not exactly silence, right? But it's you doing it, not instead listening even.
Right. I would. You can find on YouTube, if you so choose, like 1 hour of the Jesus prayer.
Yeah.
What? You just turn it on and it just goes for an hour, and okay, that's great. But like you can do that yourself. But that's what I mean. It doesn't. We don't need to be stimulated necessarily. We've kind of gone from one extreme to the other because we are mostly extremists. But we try to be moderate as Orthodox Christians, and silence seems to me something moderate. And if we want to say that, if we want the Jesus prayer, then we say that ourselves. We don't turn on YouTube and let YouTube say it for us.
That example is actually, it's a very good example of like man's hubris trying to use technology to kind of grab what was given to the saints. Like many, like Saint Silouan or Saint Joseph the Hesychast were given the Jesus prayer in their hearts automatically. But that was
not automatically, but it would go kind of automatically.
Yeah, it would go kind of. So they had this spiritual gift that they encountered that is a very different thing than just flipping a switch, having things go through the circuits and the wires. make the
Although-
sound come out.
I would like to put a plug in for Father Collins' audio recording of the sermons. He's also recorded up to 12 hours of silence when we forget to turn it off afterwards. So we're thinking about maybe posting that on YouTube, just silence. So you turn on the silence, and maybe people will engage more if they can turn on the silence on YouTube.
We have about 20 gigs of silent audio.
So that's next. We have that to look forward to during Great Lent.
You're welcome.
Other questions? All right, that was a great talk. Michael, thank you so much for doing that. Thank you to everyone for your great questions. We'll have another lecture next week.